Welcome to the third talk from our series of pandemic resilient cities. My name is Armando Caroca. I'm an architect and urban designer from Chile, currently based in London. To introduce you a little bit this project, this pandemic resilient cities is part of a project and a collaboration between our platform, from which I'm part, Think Fast, a collective urban response to COVID-19, and Emergency Architecture and Human Rights, an NGO from which Michele Di Marco has invited us to be part of this project. So we thank him, and we are also this pandemic resilient city is part of the Copenhagen Architecture Festival. So we also thank the organization of the festival for inviting us. I would invite you also to watch the previous talk. It's been 2 talks so far, and you can see all the links in the information and the description that we will post below this video on YouTube and some other platforms. So so today's talk, the number 3, which is called Urban Living, Density and Pandemics. In this talk, we will focus on the spatial challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, with a particular focus on the notion of density, which is at the core of most and many of the current discussions that urban practitioners and researchers are having in these days. And density has several paths, several parts: housing density, minimum standards of living, urban density and the risk in overcrowded refugee camps and informal settlements, but also social distancing and access to public space, etc., etc. So there are several issues there. We want to know, first of all, if density deserves the given relevance regarding cities and the spread of viruses and other diseases, and how density interacts with other aspects such as socio-spatial segregation, housing construction standard, and multiple layers of spatial and socio-economic vulnerability. We also want to discuss the idea of an adequate density for our cities. Is that even a possible idea? Can we define an adequate density? And the importance of developing a data-driven and science-based urban planning and decision-making. We also think it's really important. Finally, we want to discuss a bit how all this can take place while advancing social justice and respect for human rights. So our first speaker is Francisco Vergara Perusic. He's a Chilean architect, urban planner, and researcher. He currently works as a researcher in critical urban theory, and also is a director of the Center of Production of Space, Centro de Producción del Espacio, at the Universidad de las Américas in Chile. It's a research cluster which is investigating urban economy, critical urbanism, and socio-spatial practices. This center uses the intellectual oeuvre and the work of Henri Lefebvre and other Marxists and neo-Marxist approaches as the main theoretical framework for its investigation, to deliver outcomes searching for spatial justice, illuminating contradictions in urban life. So we will be discussing some of his discoveries in the city of Santiago, capital city of Chile. So we will have only 6 minutes for Francisco, so I leave you the space for you. Thank you very much for being today here.
Well, thank you for this huge opportunity to be here discussing about all these dark things that are happening now in the world. We are here in Santiago, speaking from the country that nowadays is leading the number of contagion per million people. Right now, today, we are the first country in the world. So we are in the middle of the outbreak, the planetary outbreak we are facing. So I would like to present some ideas and reflections about the origin of this lecture that we are having here, specifically about density. Maybe density now is having not a very good press, if you want to put it in that way, because of course many people now is afraid to live very close to each other because all this contagion and all the things that have been said about the social distancing. on that things. But we have another huge challenge in the future, which is not in the future, actually, it's in the past, which is the climate emergency. And we are over that. And many people is already connecting this coronavirus pandemic with this social emergency, planetary emergency of the climate change. So one of the findings from urban planning has been that density may be one of the solutions in the future for facing properly the challenges of climate change. So I believe so. And I have some data to share about it and how the big cities are getting more complicated with the coronavirus rather than the dense cities, where it is easier to trace the cases, where it's easier to make control over the expansion of these cases, and also where is it not in all dense cities, but in dense cities where you have good spaces, and that is my main point here. You will have better opportunities to stay at home, to lock down, to enjoy the space of social distancing. So just I have I note down. I always do the same thing. I write the thing. I never read it. So I will try to read it because I want to be very precise with the time. I have 3 ideas and 1 main change that I would like to share in order to contribute to the manifesto that you are producing. That it's very interesting for me, for my understanding at least. These approaches, we were developing these approaches before the pandemic, thinking more in the climate emergency, but in our understanding, this pandemic show up how this density is important even more now. The density is not only, like put more people together in one building or in one area. It's more a systematic transformation of some cities that don't have that density yet. That's especially visible in the global south, I think. At least what we understand for density demands a change in the disciplinary approach to how we design cities. So I have 3 points, as I said, and 1 final point that is like what we need to first address to get to that point. So density, number 1, is density is the key for the future. Yes, we're in a pandemic scenario and we are all freaking because outbreaks can emerge from dense areas, etc. However, our real change as civilization is still the climate emergency. So, okay, well, let's be optimistic. The vaccine will appear in the future, maybe next year, maybe this year. Some people is investing a lot of money and they're gonna make a lot of money afterwards of that changes. And afterwards, when the city comes back to life, contamination and environmental degradation will appear again. Now you see all these dolphins in Venice, like in Chile, you see you are seeing whales in the port. So that's nature is taking back the territory, but we're going to expel them back again when this thing ends. The main challenge to us as experts is planning to rethink density to make it feasible. And that leads me to the second point. The new architecture for climate emergency, we need to think about that. And one of the lessons of Le Corbusier is that the international style, the Siam and the modern movement start after a pandemic of the Spanish flu. After the pandemic, all the architecture was transformed. And that was a pursuit for hygiene, to clean spaces, wider windows, white houses, etc. So easy to clean. So that implies that we need to rethink about that also. We need to rethink about how we face architecture. And as in 1920, we are facing now a compulsory revolution in architecture that we need to rethink the typologies. We cannot afford anymore these tiny houses, these matchbox flats. We need to advance in a more ambitious project of architecture where housing is a public good, not anymore an asset, a financial asset. And that leads me to the third point. Housing is a public good, like highways, like water, like energy, like all this. We have housing as a public good. We need to think about it. So let's take the model of Vienna. Maybe you're going to ask me some questions so I can expand a little bit more afterwards. So let's keep in mind the model of Vienna as one of examples. And finally, a new urban agenda for action. This pandemic makes a call for saying, we need to update the urban agenda. The new urban agenda of 2016 is not useful anymore. We need to change it, we need to update it, and we need to think about what typologies of urban design can contribute to rethink this post-pandemic world. That's what I have, like a triggering idea, so maybe then we can go deeper into another.
That's perfect. Thank you very much, Francisco. I think that you gave us a lot of questions we can expand later. I would like now to introduce Emmanuel Rachou. He's an associate professor of public health from the University of Copenhagen. He holds a visiting associate professor at the African Center for Disaster Studies in Northwest University in South Africa. He has a background in economics, political science, and sociology, and holds a PhD from Lund University in Sweden, focused on disaster recovery coordination in the post-tsunami scenario in India. From 2014 to 2016, he was part of Changing Disaster Research Project at the University of Copenhagen, was on the core organizing team of the North European Conference on Emergency and Disaster Studies Needs, 2015 to 2017. So thank you very much for being here today and for your time. So I would like to leave the word to you, Emmanuel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to sort of share my thoughts. I think Francesco laid the ground really well, and the way he ended in terms of the need for a new urban agenda. But I think that's absolutely true. I mean, if we look at data today, over 55% of our people reside in urban areas. It's going to increase. It's definitely not going to stop. And for me, I think that one of the things that has been very central to the COVID-19 discussions and should continue to do so is the fact that social inequality is sitting at the heart of these discussions and must be. Because if we look at our informal settlements in the global south, there's roughly around 30 to 50% of urban population in the global south who live in informal settlements. And very often people living in informal settlements in cities are also worst affected when you look at urban flooding, when you look at other natural hazards as well. It is exactly these same populations that we're talking about that today are having issues you can't really be part of a physical distancing program because of density, right? Your access to basic resources, not only housing, but water, public infrastructure, all of that is central to these discussions. And I think COVID has really brought that up to the policy forum, to all of us, saying that at the end of the day, a lot of this is about basic human rights. It's about basic access to all of these things, right? If we look at density, yes, it's important. For example, now the COVID, but for example, if you look at an informal settlement, many informal settlements, when there's a fire truck can't go in. Because of the way some of these informal settlements are laid out. And I think Professor David Sanderson recently wrote a piece in The Conversation about this. And I think for once, the invisible of society of some sort, right? Like who are these people who live mostly in the informal settlements? It's most often the marginalized, it's most often the migrants who are going to the cities, who are fleeing environmental stress, for example. Who live in really harsh conditions. And all of a sudden, the invisible have become the visible in many discussions. If you look at India, if you look at the migrant crisis, it's primarily people who live in informal settlements. And I think what we really need to take away is there's a lot of learning from the past that has not been put into place yet. And COVID is just bringing all of these discussions back again. Disaster scholars have spoken about social vulnerability for decades now. And that vulnerability discussion is absolutely central, even when we're discussing the Corona debate. Number one, as I said, yes, we need to talk about the new urban agenda. Very recently, I wrote a piece where we said pandemics can more or less be called moving disasters. And when we were thinking about it, and when I wrote about it, we were looking at it more from a transboundary perspective, because this has really shown, COVID has shown us the transboundary nature of the crisis. But I think it's an interesting take, what Francesco was saying also, in terms of how you can even look at this even within a city in terms of how it's been moving, right? I think that would be an interesting reflection. I think there's a lot to talk about, particularly now in terms of the science policy interfaces at all levels, and I think it's really important to bring that perspective in. It's extremely important to think about crowded places such as refugee camps, for example, as well across the world, because of, again, access to resources, access to healthcare, and the fact that if anything sort of comes up in these places, it would become very difficult to handle. And I think going ahead, we definitely need to be looking at this from a much more closer, take a much more closer look at our urban spaces. What has gone wrong today? How do we need to redefine, reshape our urban spaces? And I think this is, the COVID-19 has sort of brought these discussions to the table, and these discussions should stay alive, I hope, for a long time.
I think we can maybe start a conversation based on what you have said and what Francisco has said. It's really interesting. I think, first of all, the idea of the new urban agenda, I find it particularly motivating and challenging. And I wanted to know maybe how this could be. And one question I had in advance that maybe can be connected with this is, for both of you, is that what is the role you see on science and data-based decision-making on this new way of looking at the cities? Like we've seen, for example, in the case of Francisco, he's been working, tracing the cases of coronavirus in Santiago, how it's been moving, and that requires, that's data-driven research. And also your work in disaster risk, that's also pretty much based on data and collection of empirical information, etc., etc. So it's, do you think science based on data-based planning could be one thing to think of in this new urban agenda for any of you, or both of you, ideally?
Yeah, I think, yes, science, I think a lot of countries have started to realize that scientists need to be at the heart of this debate. And but I think going ahead, we will see more discussions on science policy interfaces, absolutely. And as you said, whether it's the COVID or whether anything else, I think all policy should be driven by science. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And evidence-based sort of policy making. And again, there is discussions not only in the global north, but also in the global south around how do we use our scientific advisors to inform policy. But I think there's a lot of clash and sort of, it's unclear what is the role of some of our scientific advisors in many of these places. And I think that really needs to be clarified.
Yeah, sorry, before going to Francisco, I just, because we've seen that science is also denied strongly. I mean, when it's not beneficial for politicians, etc., like Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, he has just wiped out the information data of coronavirus yesterday because it's not good for him to let the truth be known. So what do you think? Is now an opportunity for science? Are more the opportunity for science to be advanced now, or is in fact the opposite? It can be even seen as a threat for politicians or by politicians. What do you think about it? It's something that is going to be opened, or something that is going to be resisted even more?
There's definitely going to be challenges, no doubt about that. And I think as much as the challenges are being put on the table, I think there's also opportunities being reflected in terms that this is important, that these discussions are important. We sometimes, we're having these discussions all across the world in terms of that universities and science and spaces of science should actually be allowed to do what they're supposed to do, allowed to not only generate science but also communicate science. And to be able to do that, we should hopefully not have any hindrances. And the fact that scientists should be able to communicate what they do, both to public and to policy. But you're right, we will definitely see challenges.
Thank you. Francisco, what do you think?
Well, Emmanuel said something very relevant in his speech, which is now we need to revisit all questions because we're committing the same mistakes. And that is a classical mistake in where you are not using science in your behavior, because science, you know, like the scientific method, you have a question, you try with one experiment, it doesn't work, then you change the experiment. You don't change the questions. So it's like if you try all the time with the same experiment, you are stubborn. You're not doing anything productive. And my problem with this is, okay, well, we need science. We should have authorities and leaders who are science-oriented, you know, like they make decisions based on evidence. But how we get to that kind of leaders, we don't have any. I mean, in the world, look, Boris Johnson in the UK, for instance. So even having the best universities in the planet for many these rankings and stuff, he don't listen. Look, Bolsonaro in South America, also Brazil have a huge group of scientists everywhere in all the states, and still he doesn't want to listen. So how can we make them listen? Is that the question? I mean, the data is there in journals, in you know, in even in Twitter, you can find data and information from scientists. But how you convince these authorities? I think, and that's my stance now, scientists must get political in a way. I'm not saying like not necessarily ideologically, but at least have a base point, a base where you start to discuss, which is with evidence over the table. And evidence should be methodologically validated by peers, and then you can discuss the interpretation of the data. But then you don't discuss the data, you discuss the evidence and how you interpret the strategies that you're going to take after having the data over the table. I think that that's the main point. The first point is to having that kind, but it demands a revolution in the political democracy that we have now, because it will imply in a way that how you compel the authorities to say, okay, this is the data, and we don't listen to that. That's happening in Chile right now. I mean, that happened. They built a scientist board of experts to assess the ideas of the government, but now many of people, scientists working in that board, they quit the board because they say they are not listening. We have here all days discussing the points, but then we deliver some alternative, deliver some strategies, but they don't listen. They do what they want. So that's the point. How we connect the political realm, the political parties, the political authorities with the science as a political matter. That's something that I think that needs to be connected in order to advance to the biggest challenge, which is a climate emergency.
Yeah, it's really great because I was thinking that you usually have the idea that density is quite scientific, or at least it's quite technocratic decision, or how many people per square meter or per square kilometer, right? It sounds like cold, and but it can become really political, as we're discussing now. I mean, it's like our conversation led us to that realm without even looking for it, I think. I was thinking also that also how do you connect scientific data and scientific decision making with people in communities, like people in informal settlements, people living in the cities, because I think if they realize how important is data, maybe they can also advance that agenda. Like they will ask for data. Otherwise, it will become another kind of dichotomy, like the people, the traditional, the communitary knowledge versus the scientific knowledge. And again, we have this kind of two poles in which politicians will go one side and another, depending on what's more convenient. So it's really difficult. I would like to ask you a couple of things for the things I've been reading about your work. For example, I think you mentioned it a bit already, but in one of your papers you say that housing should be rethought from being a financial asset to a sanitation barrier. Also, and it could be housing must be planned as a human right instead of a source of wealth. You mentioned that. If you could expand on that, how housing is a sanitation barrier. Is urban planning has to refocus on housing, like back to basics? You can talk a bit more about it. You already mentioned that.
Yeah, well, we find out that I mean, there may be another approaches, but we had an approach that housing prices, in the case of Chile, has been the best way to understand how the virus moved around the cities, our Chilean cities. Housing prices. I mean, it doesn't mean that the price is infectious, you know, is the variable of housing prices is better predictor of how the virus will move around the cities. We can then get into that, but what is important for us is that because housing has become a very profitable business, and and the people getting involved in that is profit-oriented and not oriented to producing good cities. For example, in Chile, many big companies of real estate development are commanded by economists, not architects or builders. You know that like it used to be before the 90s, and that is a transformation in the objectives of housing, that where you don't have the objective of the company producing housing is not producing good housing, it's producing profit, and profit only, because there's an economist behind that. So one of the consequences, partial consequences of that, is that the reduction of sizes, because if you have smaller houses, you can put more housing units to sell, and then it's more profitable. It's like Coca-Cola, you know, you have a lot of Coca-Cola in one box, and then you can find a better way to put more Coca-Colas, and then you create a smaller Coca-Cola, and then you build it anyway. So that's like the mindset of these people. And what we need to advance is to recover the importance of housing as a social issue, as a human right at the end. And for doing so, one of the alternatives to do it concretely is to rethink the space. For instance, now the UN Habitat recommend to have at least 22.5 square meters per people in a flat. We think that that should advance towards at least 30 square meters per people. In Chile, the regulations allow at least 15 square meters per people, and they people selling that. So, you know, 15 square meters, imagine the person 3 months in lockdown is like walking in the walls, and it's crazy. So that's one thing. Another thing that is key is to force the existence of terrace for flats. All flats should have a terrace and at least 4 square meters. So you can have a small garden and walk. You can walk there a little bit. Another thing that is key is at least all flats should have 1 room plus 1. You know, like you have your bedroom, but also you have another room for leisure, for library, or for doing draft and whatever. You know, you need to have more spaces, and that will demand a huge change. And for advancing in that change, I think, and taking some examples from Europe especially, I think that the housing production should be commanded by the state, where you have private companies, of course, but like producers of housing, not like sellers of housing. That is the change. And also that maybe we need to think about the idea of housing and changing the idea of right to housing to the right to accommodation, which is different in a way that, okay, well, you will have, if you get burned, you have already a house, an accommodation. You don't need anything else. You just for the fact that you were born, you have the right to accommodation. And if you are sleeping in the streets, well, it's your choice at the end, not because you can afford a house. That should be a human right, like water, like air, like infrastructure, like parks, etc. I think that is a substantial change, and it need to come from an international agreement, I think.
Thank you, Francisco. Manuel, just maybe Yes, last question, but the idea of moving disaster is also really interesting, and learning from the past. So you mentioned that this is a disaster also. So also, well, that would be another topic, like seeing this as a disaster, which I completely agree. I think that's also a way of seeing it. We can use most of the knowledge that we have from disaster risk management. You say that this is a moving disaster because it doesn't respect any boundaries. But how? But at the same time, it's a very we can say it's a very localized problem. It's intensified when you have overcrowded informal settlements, etc. So where would you say should be the stress, the focus on the governance? It should be on the local, very critical hotspots like refugee camps and informal settlements, or it's an international thing because it's moving. So where would you put the efforts if you had to choose? Very
If
difficult.
I had, oh my God, that's a very tall ask. But I think I don't think it's one or the other.
Okay.
And right now, I think particularly in the way we're seeing COVID, but because there's a lot of transboundary decisions that need to be made because of border controls and those sort of things. Let's not forget that at this time, there might be people stranded somewhere, and there are all of those issues that need to come into play, right? So there's definitely sort of bilateral, multilateral discussions happening. But at the same time, I think there's a huge role for local governments to play. And taking the case of India, for example, I mean, our local governments, our district administrations have been at the forefront of the COVID-19 struggles. And what do we need? We need massive support from national governments, every possible way, right? Because right now, in many places, we see the politics of COVID-19 in a way coming out. Politicization of the pandemic in itself.
Yeah.
I think that should not happen, because no matter who is in power or not, I think this is a time for everybody to come together because it's a time of crisis. So, whether or not whether or not there's any sort of, there might have been past disputes between national and the local or the subnational or the regional level. I think the local governments should be sort of given the power to sort of take decisions and act quickly, move fast, and be able to sort of work with their local populations. And having said it, I think local populations themselves have a huge role to play in decision making. In India, for example, we saw the lockdown came as a decision overnight, and that put a lot of people into difficulty. Migrants were stranded, migrants were walking, trying to reach home thousands of kilometers. I think that's what needs to happen, right? Also, not only urban planning, but planning and decision making about how do we sort of how do we communicate our decisions? And I think that has become an important part of this debate. And having said it all, for me, all of this, I think social inequality has really come out central to this. I just want to repeat that it's not about density. This is about inequality.
That's perfect. That's a perfect final remark. Completely agree. I have to close today's session. Thank you to you both, Manuel and Francisco. Sorry for doing it too short. All the topics are supposed to be discussed very long, much longer than this, but this is supposed to be a little capsule of this little pill of some of the hot topics that we're dealing now. I think it's very important to think about human rights, inequality, and how a supposedly more technical issue of density is completely about rights also. So it's you cannot separate, the same way you cannot separate the different levels of governance. I would like to thank you everyone that is now watching this, and I would highly recommend to watch the next session, which is even more political. It's about human rights and contested cities. It's going to be led by my friend and co-founder of ThinkFast, Amani Al-Shaban. And the guests are going to be Camille Boano, Professor of Urban Design and Critical Theory at the Barrio Development Planning Unit, DPU, in UCL, and Dr. Ayesha Ahmed, lecturer in Global Health at St. George University of London and honorary lecturer at the UCL Institute for Global Health. So thank you very much. Keep on watching and keep keep checking our web pages. We'll have the information below this post. So thank you very much and see you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much. See you soon, hopefully.